All right, welcome to part 4 on our segment related to Romanticism, or English Romanticism, as well as American art. We're sort of jumping back to England, and we're going to be looking at the Palace of Westminster, which is a meeting place of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the two houses of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, commonly known as the House of Parliament and its occupants. And this is really a building that's at the heart of British politics. It's a palace that lies on the north bank of the River Thames in the city of Westminster in central London. Its name, which derives from the neighboring Westminster Abbey, may refer to either the two structures, the Old Palace, a medieval building complex that was destroyed by the fire in 1834, and its replacement, which we're looking at now, the new palace that stands today. For ceremonial purposes, the palace retains its original style and status as a royal residence and the property of the crown. So the first royal palace was built on the site in the 11th century, and Westminster was the primary residence of the King of England until a fire destroyed much of the complex in 1512. After that, it served as the home of the Parliament of England, which had been meeting there since the 13th century, and also as a seat of the Royal Courts of Justice, based in and around Westminster Hall. In 1834, an even greater fire ravaged the heavily rebuilt House of Parliament, and the only medieval structure of significance to survive was Westminster Hall, the cloisters of St. Stephen's, and the chapel of St. Mary Undercroft and the Jewel Tower. So I'm going to show you the original. So basically this is a drawing of Westminster Hall in the early 19th century, and this is pretty much what is the remnants or the leftover original medieval part of the building, and we'll go back and discuss this a little bit later. So after the Great Fire in 1834, a competition was held in 1835 for the new Houses of Parliament to be built. There was a stipulation for the contest that the design had to be in either one of two styles, either Gothic, or this perpendicular Gothic style, which was the Gothic style associated with Britain over here, and you see an example, or this Elizabethan style. There were 97 entries that were submitted, and a vast majority of them were submitted in the perpendicular Gothic style. These are the two architects who ended up working on the palace. The competition to redesign the palace was won by the Westminster-born architect Charles Barry. By then, he was 40 years old and was already quite a famous architect, having built several churches and won competitions for his work. However, his own architectural style was more classical than Gothic. So Barry turned for assistance to another architect named Augustus Welby Pugin, who was 23 years old, and he was a Catholic architect and draftsman who devoted himself entirely to the pursuit of Gothic architecture. And Pugin was in fact paid £400 by Barry for assisting him in the design. During the construction of the palace, Barry came to heavily rely on Pugin in execution of these plans that he helped draw for Barry. In particular, he was in charge of details, fittings, furnishings, he really designed probably one of the most sumptuous Gothic interiors. And we'll take a look at the inside. Pugin, I think that's how you say his name, or Pugin, was known for his love of the Gothic, and for Gothic being as the right and true moral style of architecture associated with Englishness. And there has been some controversy over whether Pugin, rather than Barry, deserves the greater credit for the architectural triumph of the Palace of Westminster. So, anyway, there's a little information about the architects and their portraits. So just to give you some insight onto the construction and some of the stylistic conventions associated with this structure. It's an enormous structure, and again, it probably reminds you of some of the early palace complexes that we looked at with ancient Near Eastern art. It's an enormous structure of 1,100 rooms, 100 staircases, and 2 miles of corridors. And so one of the questions that should come to mind is why is there this interest in the revival of older styles? Because this is a building that was built in the early or mid part of the 19th century. This is the Victorian era. And so why is there this this idea of looking back towards older historical styles of architecture? So one of the things that's happening during this time is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is characterized by the production of cheap goods, and people felt, I think, very unsettled. So this new modern era seemed very ugly with its landscape of factories and steam engines that were popping up. And so people looked to the past, to the beauty of medieval architecture, as well as classical Greek and Roman art for inspiration. So it's natural for people to look back at historical styles as traditional, and this idea of tradition and history would also be very appropriate for a government building such as this. One of the things to think of, though, is that even though it's Gothic, English Gothic in style, that it's still a modern building. And you really want to think of Westminster as a modern office building, sort of cloaked in a medieval facade. While the style is Gothic, the structure incorporated modern innovations such as being situated on a concrete slab. That's not medieval, and this was due for ventilation purposes. The central tower was also later adapted to help with ventilation as well. And so these were sort of modern concerns that had to be addressed. You're probably familiar with Big Ben over here, which is the clock tower. That is to symbolize this idea of a village clock, and one that is supposed to be for all of London. So the Gothic revival is in essence a 19th century Victorian fantasy of medieval artisan craftsmanship and a time where care was taken to make things by hand as opposed to being mass produced. Right. So English Gothic is a bit different than French Gothic. And we really didn't get a chance to really look at English Gothic. English Gothic is also known as the perpendicular style. As its name suggests, the chief characteristic of perpendicular Gothic architecture is the emphasis on strong vertical lines. It's not too different than that sort of that tallness and sort of the verticality of French Gothic. We really see this idea of verticality, though, mostly in the window and the tracery and wall paneling, usually in the interior of the church. It's also characterized by roof vaulting, which became very elaborate and ornate with a multitude of vaulting ribs that spread outward in a fan shape, ornamented with pendants and cross ribs that served as a purely decorative function. So it, like French Gothic, it was pretty decorative, but I think in addition to emphasizing the verticality of the building, in which, what the French Gothic did, it was this idea of soaring up to heaven. I think there were perpendicular English Gothic style churches that also emphasized a balance of horizontal and vertical lines as well. Because when you look at Westminster, you definitely, it's definitely a very horizontal, building, as well as a tall building. So what we're looking at is the central lobby of the House of Parliament. It's situated between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It was meant to be a space where constituents could meet their members of Parliament. Metal grills on the doorways. It's hard to see think they're kind of, spread throughout. These actually were originally in the House of Commons, and they were actually installed where women could be seated to watch Parliament. So let me kind of show you a picture. So this is the ladies' gallery, and so this is what they're talking. So there's this room in the House of Commons, and these sort of screened or metal screens that allowed the women to sort of, be separate from watching Parliament, but also be able to watch it. Those have been taken down and installed in the doorways here in the actual central lobby of the House of Parliament. And this is supposed to symbolize the suffrage movement. In the central octagonal space, there are statues of kings and queens of England and Scotland that are placed around. And there are 4 large mosaics over each doorway representing the 4 saints who represent the different areas of the UK. So England is St. George, Scotland is St. Andrew, Wales is St. David, and North Ireland is St. Patrick. The use of iron architecture, which started in the neoclassical period, became even more important to Romantic architects. So you do want to think of this revival architecture as in this movement of Romanticism that we've been looking at. Architects concerned with reviving the past architectural styles, like Gothic, really embrace this use of ironwork. And you can sort of see it here. Here's a close-up as well. Really adventurous architects used stone on the exterior, but were often not afraid of the iron as an exposed structural element. So before they would actually try to hide the iron as a support. Progressive architects found the elegance and malleability of ironwork very satisfying, especially when combined with these, huge walls of glass that really do characterize the palace. So again, sorry, those are those metal doors I talked about earlier. So this is the last image that you have to know. So when the old House of Parliament burned down, Westminster Hall remained the last vestige of the medieval Parliament building. So when we look at this, we can also look at some other aspects of Perpendicular Gothic architecture. One of the things is a hammer beam roof. This is where advances in joinery and a better understanding of how to distribute the load and thrust of a ceiling weight allowed roofs which could span over great spaces. The hammer beam roof is the wooden equivalent of the stone vaulting used in the great cathedrals of that time. Simply put, hammer beam construction makes use of short horizontal and vertical beams to distribute the weight of the roof. These short beams rise in steps from the top of the wall to the roof peak, creating a more open space than earlier techniques allowed. So this use of the hammer beam roof allowed for, again, a more sort of open, unified space. Although the timbers, which made up the supporting element in the hammer beam roofs were structural, they were also very decorative elements as well. The meeting place of the timbers were often adorned with pendants or fanciful carvings, and the timbers themselves were often painted and gilded. Okay, so that's it in terms of our last segment. I know it was kind of a choppy segment. We talked about, English Romanticism, then we kind of went into American art, and then we kind of switched back in American art to looking at neoclassical art, or we actually looked at Romanticism and neoclassical art in in America, and we kind of jumped back to England. I'll be passing out an overview that kind of goes over these different schools and movements and are associated with each of the image, so you can keep them you have a better understanding of them. Also, please don't forget to watch any of the Khan Academy videos that I might have posted that relate to any of the works posted here. Our next segment we'll deal with the later art in the 19th century. So stay tuned.